So these are called the object lesson. This comes from how people used to teach in America back in the 1860s. The object lesson was this idea where you took like a simple object, and it could be really anything, because they would even use like bugs, but they'd also use sewing needles, and they would look at this object and you would work through the levels of cognition. This is before a lot of this gets developed. It's actually really interesting from a sort of a history of education. And the first thing they teach children to do, I don't know why my phone's on its. The first thing they teach children to do is how to make observations. So they say, take this sewing needle and describe its qualities. So they're just going to describe its physical attributes. So we're going to start there. We're going to work through the object lesson together using the chat box. And we're going to start off with this thing. This is a metal. And I'd like you guys in the chat box to describe this metal's physical properties to me. It's the first thing that comes when you see it. How would you, like, for example, if you were describing this to somebody who couldn't see the metal, how would you describe it? That's good. So we've got some shape, some material. If you guys had to guess what metal that was made of, do you think you could guess it? I'm trying to remember. I don't think I wrote that down what it's made out of, actually. Could be bronze. It's hard to tell when it's, this is quite old. We can assume. We can figure out how old it is actually pretty precisely, but it's aged, it's patina, you know, so it's harder to tell what material it's made out of once it's oxified. There's a statesman on there, pretty regal looking dude. You guys know who it is? It's George Washington. It does have an image on the back. That image is, the back, as you can see, has not aged as well as the front. Look really closely at the figure on the back. What do you think that's a figure of? Could be a soldier. It definitely, that was what I thought when I first saw it, especially because I saw the front image first and saw Washington. And then I saw the back image, but then I took a little closer. Maybe Mercury, a lot of Greek, Greco-Roman symbols on our medallions and coinage. I'll also say part of the inspiration for this is we're trying to show people more what it's like working in a museum field. So this activity we're doing right now kind of models how the curators process in objects. You know, the first thing you start with is just honing in on the specific details. So it's got a hole in it for hanging. The hint that it's a metal, so it's meant to be displayed in some way. Although the metal is, the hole sometimes to me does not look original because it punches through at the top of the coin on the face side. The L is punched through, which you would think if it was designed that way, it wouldn't have interrupted the font, right? Now, that's a good question. Does the hole drilled in it change the value? Yes and no. If it was a coin, if you drill a hole through a penny, that's no longer legal tender, which is something that they used to do back in the day. You can turn it into a bank, but you know they won't accept it at a grocery store. But for us, no, it doesn't change the historical value of this because it tells more of a story that someone punched a hole in it, if they punched a hole in it or if it was manufactured that way. But no, I wouldn't say it changes the value necessarily. So the figure on the back, I'm going to read you guys because there's also this inscription, which is very difficult to read. So it's an American Indian. Does that make more sense now that you're looking at it? You can kind of see it's sort of like in a, almost like a loincloth, maybe has a bow pressing against its hip. Where did I write that down? There's some notes here. So the front of the medal says, starting at the top left behind George Washington's head, General Washington, inscribed to his memory by D. Eccleston. So we can figure out who made this medal. Lancaster, MDCCCV, which is 1805. It's not the same as the statue that's on top of Congress. It's just sort of a generic American Indian man. The statue on top of Congress is the personification of, well, always gets messed up, Liberty. I was just looking at it again. I always forget which the statue on Congress. I'm pretty sure it's Liberty, but we can check. And the back of the medal says he laid the foundations of American liberty in the 18th century. Innumerable millions yet unborn will venerate the memory of the man who obtained their country's freedom. This land was ours. So a whole lot of information stamped into the metal. We now know who made it, what year it was probably made. It was 1805. So we know that sort of in context, this is shortly after the death of George Washington, just a few years later. And it has these sort of mixed messaging where it has this commemoration of Lincoln, but also this reminder of the heritage of American Indians with this central panel in the back, with an American Indian sort of in a regal pose himself. We thought it was a soldier. And it says, this land was ours. So sort of doing this dual messaging. Remember what my next slide was. Yeah, oh, yeah. I was smart enough to put the transcription there and then silly enough to not remember that I typed that out. I've been sick. So this is what it says. So the next thing that you do in an object lesson is you compare the object to other objects of its type. So when you look at a sewing needle, for example, and what we used earlier, you might ask students to compare how it's different from, say, a push pin and how its form suits that difference. So the first thing that I thought of was other struck metal images of George Washington. And for me, that immediately brings to mind the quarter, right? So these are the images of Washington we're most familiar with. These are two different ones. I just discovered this when I was putting this together yesterday. Do you guys know what's going on with the 2022 quarter? Have you guys seen this? I don't follow coin news much, but I thought this was really cool. Has anyone seen? I actually like the one on the left, the 2022 one, a great deal more. I feel like it feels more warm. Maybe that's just me. Maybe just because it's new. Do you know, looking at them, which one is the, well, I already told you, but so for those who haven't seen, of course, the Mint does special quarters every so often. Yeah, his chin especially, thank you, Patricia. I didn't want to, that was one of the first things I noticed, that his face looks not fatter, but fuller. It looks more like an older man's face, you know? So the 2021 quarter, that's what we're used to seeing. That's what's been on the coin since probably any of us were born. In the 1930s, they decided to make this commemorative coin of George Washington. I ended up going down a whole rabbit hole with this yesterday, and I thought it would be fun, a fun little midpoint. But there was a lot of different people who struck models. It was a contest. Congress reached out to all these people, and they end up picking the one on the left, on the one on the right, the 2021 quarter. That's what we're used to. The one from 2022 was submitted by a woman who, oh, goodness gracious, I'm gonna forget the name. I'll just pull it up here. She submitted a design and it was not accepted. And so this year, Congress is doing the celebration of women on quarters, which they've done something similar before. And these are some of the women that we'll be seeing. I remember when this was announced. But I'm trying to find the woman who did the original portrait of Washington. But since he was in contention all those years ago, they decided that they would make her the face of the quarter. So it's like a sort of a different, like a different reality. You know, there's a timeline somewhere where we're used to this quarter instead. Laura Garden Fraser, that's it. Yeah. So she was this contentious designer during the competition. I just thought it was really cool, and I was super shocked when I looked it up because at first that was the only image that came up when I typed in quarter, and I was like, that's not right. Like it was like a Twilight Zone moment where I was like, I know that I'm not looking at what I think I'm looking at. That's me and my wife. So looking at these quarters and then looking at this medallion, we noted the difference between the 2022 quarters and the 2021. What about the quarters and this image of Washington? What's the most notable differences or similarities? The metal, the coinage. yeah, what is he wearing in that medal? That was the very first thing that struck me. The hair is kind of almost it's more like the 2021 quarter, but it's so curly on the ponytail. It almost looks super anachronistic. To me, it looks more like the 17th century, like the 1600s, because he's wearing, it looks like he's wearing a breastplate and a shirt underneath, more like royalty or soldiers in the 16th century, 17th century. And specifically, it reminded me of these guys, the conquistadors. See the breastplate with the formal shirt underneath. So we have, that's the left is Balboa, and then Pizarro, and then Hernan Cortez. But I was also thinking of this medal as sort of a commemoration of Washington. I was thinking about how it resembles other commemorations of Washington, like the Washington Monument, or this infamous depiction of Washington. And I wonder, in a way, these depictions are meant to be, like, what's the ultimate goal of them? If we're commemorating Washington, are we trying to make a lifelike portrait, or are we trying to make something mythical? Because if we're making something mythical, this is the one that succeeds the most. But this one is so strange. The nationality of the artist is very interesting, and we're going to look at that. So the next part of what we're doing is, because there's also, we talk about form and function, but we're going to look at some primary sources to help contextualize this. So the idea for the students who do this is they try to garner as much information as they can from observation alone, and then helping them realize in a very sort of on the nose way, there's only so much information you can gather, even though there's a lot of information. Like if I needed to research this really has all the information I need. D. Eccleston, 1805, George Washington medal, right? Even some phrases I can use to search. But here's what we have in the museum record. This is the first source that we have. This comes out of the catalog record. So this was typed by one of the curators way, way back. I think I have this was, I might not have written it down. Most of this stuff comes from like the 30s. And it'll have, it was donated by this person on this day, and it was processed by this person. But I didn't always record that. No, I didn't for this one. Maybe I should. So widely distributed, but struck in England. So the nationality of the artist was, he was English, D. Eccleston, and it's popular enough that Eccleston medal is in capital letters. And it was at the time, it was the largest portrait of Washington that you could get on a medal. There is this really fascinating through line after Washington dies. The British make so many commemorative items to sell to Americans, and among the British as well. He was oddly popular, and there's a whole other object we talk about where sort of the British in the 1800s, they sort of put a cultural claim on Washington. They kind of Britishize him like they do with a lot of folks, but it's really interesting how they do that. So here's another source that we have, and this is from a catalog in 1885. So this is Russell Rouleau and George Fuld made a catalog of all the medal portraits of Washington, because there were enough, and they sort of analyzed them, and they distinguished them as sort of art pieces and commemorative pieces. And so they talk about the strange imagery on this medal. This piece apparently was issued with a twist of subtle satire. The obverse of the medal depicts Washington in a heavy suit of armor, a singular conceit, notes Baker, meaning that nobody else had really done that. The reverse has an Indian standing head downcast, with an arrow in his right hand and leaning on a bow. Most of that detail has been lost in our version. You definitely can't see the arrow anymore. Then surrounding the Indian at center are the words, "The land was ours." The medal appears to be more of a commentary on the expropriation by colonists of Indian lands than a tribute to Washington. Yet the phrase beginning, quote, innumerable millions yet unborn is truly laudatory of the nation's president, commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War. So what Rousseau and Fuld are trying to decide is the medal laudatory or is it a critique? When you look at this, think back before we read these sources, do you think it was positively commemorating Washington or critiquing his legacy? Do you think it was more positive or more negative? when you first saw it? Same. Anyone else positive? Anyone negative? I don't think that's often the knee-jerk response. Mm-hmm. So it is a very powerful image. Yeah. Something I discovered because the expropriation of Indian lands was definitely more normalized back then, but it was still very contentious. We had a speaker come in who was an expert in this particular history of Washington's presidential policy regarding Indian lands. It was not without controversy. And this is actually evidence of that, because now we've read the source. These metal historians, specifically they are historians of Washington metals, are having difficulty deciding if it's more positive or more negative. But we can actually go to the source and find out what the intention may have been, or get closer. So Daniel Eccleston was actually a huge figure in a very specific population at the time. He was an activist among the Quaker population, and there's a whole book written about Daniel Eccleston. So this comes from that book. By 1769, Eccleston was traveling around Montreal as well as the Hudson Valley and Great Lakes region. The time he spent with Native Americans may have helped develop Eccleston's Quaker outlook on the value of people, for his vision of a world in which all were equal and all valued, no matter what their race or religion. Eccleston recalled, so before I get to that, he traveled throughout North America and spent a lot of time with Native Americans and developed a great sympathy and an adoration of them. And then he comes through Canada down into America. Eccleston recalled, during my residence in Virginia when at Alexandria, I had the pleasure, and I may also add the honor, of meeting with General Washington, who gave me an invitation to call and spend a few days with him on his estate at Mount Vernon. What is certain is that Daniel Eccleston was a man who engaged with and to an extent anticipated the issues and themes of his time. He deserves serious consideration as a leading example of the development of a significant body of provincial Enlightenment thought. He was a part of the radicalization of England that took place in the wake of the American and French revolutions. There remains no doubt that the man himself lived life to the full and left a legacy of value. And that's true. There's a lot of Patricias in the chat. But yeah, especially in this time, and this is something I assert, is that many people think that negative critiques of Washington are a modern invention, but it's more like a sine wave, where depending on what's going on in the culture and what's going on in a lot of different ways, the response to Washington tends to be positive, but is sometimes more negative in tone. But this is interesting. So Eccleston, not only did he meet and spend a lot of time with the American Indians, but he met Washington and spent an evening with him. He stayed at Mount Vernon for a few days and got to know him. And when Washington died, this was how he commemorated him. So I think I want to sort of break those apart. Where first, so when we think of this as an artist just making an image of Washington, does it change how seriously or how authoritative we view this medal, knowing that Eccleston met Washington? Or do you think it matters that he met him? I also think it matters, because he's not forming an opinion purely off of hearsay or stories. Yeah, it really is the stories are two-sided. But I do wonder, because of the explicit critique, something else that actually becomes, there's a flip in the 20th century. The conquistadors were not really highly celebrated. The idea of conquistadors as violent conquerors is very old. In fact, during Washington's administration, his Secretary of War, who was Henry Knox, I think it's Henry Knox. Henry Knox said that he was worried that history was going to view Washington's administration as violently as they viewed the conquistadors. And I can't shake this image. And maybe you guys can disagree. I don't know if you think the same thing. Does Washington's dress remind you of that sort of style, or is that just me? Do you think that's what Eccleston? I could not for the life of me find a source that examined the armor more in depth, but it reminded me more of the 17th century. I don't know what you guys think. It does also sort of look like a Louis XIV sort of a Alexander Dumas kind of thing. Yeah, maybe an expensive coat, although I feel like you can see his sleeves, but also there's like a weird ruffle that might be his hair continuing. It's so strange. It's maybe it's just flamboyancy. But I wonder if I liked how someone put that. Maybe it is Eccleston having trouble, because I myself have a lot of trouble sort of holding both Washingtons in my mind, because the things that occurred to the Northwest Indian Confederacy are so terrible during the war and during his presidency. But I mean, there's no denying the impact that he had on the founding of the country 200 years. Are there any pictures of it with no patina? I could not find, even the one that was in this book was about as aged as ours. I'll have to look again and see if maybe some of the details are more clear. But no, I couldn't find any pictures that had not aged, but I need to take a second look. So I guess the final thought was, thinking about where we started looking at the metal and where we've gone through in our sources. What is your kind of takeaway? What thoughts are you lingering with right now? What questions do you still have? What thoughts were provoked by the object or the sources? What are you thinking about now that we've explored this object? Yeah, Linda, I want to know, was it displayed? Did people wear it around their necks? Was it tied to something? It was widely distributed, so people used it, but what did they use it for? And who purchased it? And I want to know, what did they think when they purchased it? Because those medallion people were like, wow, this is interesting. This is satirical. It's very unique. When people bought it, were they buying it as people who were like, yes, I also am in that mindset of both praising and critiquing Washington, and this medal represents that history for me? Or were they buying it purely as a critique? Or did the satire sort of go over people's heads? Was it popular just because that portrait of Washington is really cool? I would love to find just some sort of source from someone saying, like, I owned this because of X reason. And we're never going to see that. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that this medal, I think that George Washington, I think one of the reasons that he's remained such a staple, besides, I mean, clearly, I mean, talk about having a defining role as first president and sort of the beginning of the country in a lot of ways, the founding father, that George Washington, not only is that what keeps him interesting and it's impossible to not include him in these things, but I think that to see people critiquing Washington so blatantly, so quickly after his death, and during his life, I find as well, just makes me realize that our ancestors were also thinking critically about their history, about their present, and about how the future was going to view these things. And I think that that's a really positive note to see, that people were chewing on these problems 200 years ago and will probably continue to chew on them 200 years from now. I love this medal. I got to say, it's probably one of my favorite objects that we own. And when I showed historian Colin Calloway, who is a Washington and American Indian historian, he had never seen this and he thought it was fascinating. So I sent him a picture, and that was really cool. And by the way, I'm so sorry I didn't introduce myself. This is also the second time I've been on camera today. I was at a sort of a virtual career day earlier. And so I was just thinking this kind of continuation. But my name's Kevin Lukacs. I'm the curator of education at the DAR Museum. And so I don't do curatorial work necessarily where I'm looking for objects and researching them and preserving them and collecting them and displaying them. My role is more as a communicator, where I take these objects and I find ways to talk about historical themes with people of all ages. From we're working on stuff for really young children who it's a very hard age set to develop stuff for, all the way up to high school, to college, to adults. And that's what I think is, if you design a good program that's clear and relevant for teenagers, it's probably just as valuable to adults as well. So this is a really, I'm really proud of these. Today's was the medal. And this is the most serious one that we have because we're talking about all these heavy themes. But next Friday, we'll be doing a print of the Lincoln family that's really fascinating. And I don't want to give anything away. I really encourage you to go because that one's a little bit different from this, but it'll be the same style. But it really breaks apart, I think, something similar how people thought of the Lincolns as a family. And then we'll be ending the month with this really cool piece of ceramic. And that one's really lighthearted. It's really fun. I did that for a group of children this morning, and they had a terrific time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. We will keep doing these sort of these shorter things throughout the month, and then we'll sort of be reevaluating what we're going to do this summer, probably similar stuff, a lot of projects to show everybody. And thank you so much for supporting us. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments even, we always love when we get emails where someone's like, I love this, because we file that away. And then when we go to do more, let me pull up the email here on the website. When we go to do more projects like this, it's cool to say like, hey, these 4 people who went to the object lesson, they really enjoyed it. So feel free to just email museum@dar.org, say that you enjoyed it, and show up for the next one. Tell your friends. If you're a DAR member, tell your chapter members. Correspondent docents do really cool stuff for you guys. But this is just another way to keep interacting with the DAR Museum and collections. So, and happy Friday to everyone. This is like a great, hopefully, way to spend your lunch or my coffee break. So yeah.